power is rarely quiet, but when it is, it sits across a mahogany board, waiting to trap you. Richard Sterling, a ruthless venture capitalist worth a cool $4 billion, used chess to humiliate his peers. He thrived on the crush of an opponent's ego. But on a rainy Tuesday evening, at the exclusive Oak and Iron Club, his predatory gaze landed on the wrong target, Clara Hayes. She wasn't a CIO. She wasn't a hedge fund manager. She was the girl refilling his Glenfiddich. When he challenged the waitress in front of New York's elite, he expected a comedy. Minutes later, the room fell into a deathly silence. This is the story of a shattered ego, a hidden prodigy, and the checkmate that cost a billionaire his pride. The Oak and Iron Club sat quietly on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a fortress of limestone and ivy, where New York's old money and new tech titans came to hide from the world. Inside, the air was perpetually heavy with the scent of aged cedar, expensive leather, and imported Dominican cigars. The lighting was always dim, casting long, dramatic shadows across the Persian rugs and oil paintings of men who had built empires on the backs of the working class. Clara Hayes was one of those working-class backs. At 26, Clara had mastered the art of becoming invisible. Dressed in the club's strict uniform, a crisp white button-down, a black velvet vest, and a pencil skirt that restricted her stride, she navigated the crowded VIP lounge like a ghost. Her job was to anticipate desires before they were spoken. A fresh tumbler of Macallan 25 here, an emptied crystal ashtray replaced there. She was not meant to be seen, and she certainly was not meant to be heard. To the men in tailored Brioni suits, she was merely an extension of the furniture, a functional piece of the club's opulent machinery. Clara's aching feet, however, grounded her in a painful reality. She had been on her feet for 10 hours. Her apartment in Astoria was a world away from this mahogany-paneled sanctuary, waiting for her with a stack of past-due medical bills. 2 years prior, a devastating illness had swept through her family, claiming her father and leaving Clara drowning in a sea of debt. Before that, she had been a graduate student in mathematics at Columbia University. Before that, she had been something else entirely. A child who saw the world in grids, vectors, and 64 squares. But survival had a funny way of rearranging a person's priorities. Equations and algorithms were replaced by double shifts and calculated tips. At 9 p.m., the atmosphere in the lounge shifted. The low murmur of conversations halted, replaced by a subtle, collective bracing. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Richard Sterling walked in. Richard was a man who sucked the oxygen out of any room he entered. At 42, he had built a tech empire, dismantled it, sold the scraps for billions, and reinvented himself as a venture capitalist who specialized in hostile takeovers. He was tall, impeccably groomed, and possessed a smile that never quite reached his cold, slate-gray eyes. Richard didn't just want to win. He wanted his opponents to know they had been utterly defeated. He lived for the crush. Trailing behind him were 2 sycophants from his firm, carrying his overcoat and laughing a beat too late at whatever joke he had just made. Richard ignored them. His eyes were fixed on the center of the room, where a magnificent, antique ivory and ebony chess set sat atop a polished marble table. It was the centerpiece of the Oak and Iron Club. "Thomas!" Richard barked, not looking at the maître d', who immediately materialized at his side. "My usual. And clear the center area. I feel like playing." Clara, balancing a tray of dirty martini glasses, paused near a pillar. She watched as Richard unbuttoned his suit jacket, draped it over a leather wingback chair, and sat down at the white pieces. He didn't ask if anyone wanted to play. His mere presence at the board was a summons. He expected a challenger, a sacrifice to his ego. For Clara, the sight of the chessboard always triggered a phantom ache in her chest. Her father had taught her to play when she was 5. By 10, she was beating grandmasters in simultaneous exhibitions in Washington Square Park. By 15, the pressure of competitive chess had fractured her relationship with the game, and she had walked away, swearing to never play competitively again. The board was a map of her past, a reminder of a life she had abandoned. She forced her eyes away, focusing on the rims of the glasses on her tray. "Keep your head down, Clara," she reminded herself. "Just get through the shift. Tip out. Go home." But Richard Sterling's booming voice echoed through the lounge. "Well, is anyone in this room capable of giving me a challenge tonight? Or has the intellectual pedigree of this club finally flatlined?" Clara watched from the shadows as Arthur Pendleton, an older, distinguished gentleman who had made his fortune in shipping, slowly rose from his armchair. Arthur was a kind regular, one of the few who looked Clara in the eye and said, "Thank you," when she brought him his Earl Grey tea. "I suppose I can spare a few minutes to entertain you, Richard," Arthur said, his voice calm, though Clara could see the slight tremor in his hands as he buttoned his tweed jacket. Richard smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. "Arthur, excellent. Let's see if your strategy is as outdated as your business model." The room subtly reoriented itself. Conversations died down as wealthy spectators moved their chairs closer, forming a loose, silent ring around the marble table. Clara was directed by the floor manager to stand near the perimeter, ready to serve drinks to the onlookers. She took a deep breath, clutching her serving tray to her chest, and found her eyes drawn, irresistibly, back to the 64 squares. The game began with a violence disguised as civility. Richard Sterling opened with the Queen's gambit, pushing his pawn to d4 with a sharp, echoing clack against the marble table. It wasn't just a move, it was a declaration of war. He played rapidly, his movements jerky and aggressive, designed to intimidate. He didn't just want to develop his pieces, he wanted to monopolize the center of the board and suffocate Arthur from the first minute. Arthur, conversely, played with a slow, trembling deliberation. He opted for the Nimzo Indian defense, attempting to counter Richard's aggression with flexible, hyper-modern strategy. Clara stood 10 feet away, a fresh white towel draped over her forearm, her tray held at her hip. She wasn't looking at the wealthy men surrounding the table. She was looking at the geometry of the board. Without meaning to, her brain booted up an old, familiar software. She wasn't Clara the waitress anymore. She was Clara the prodigy. Lines of force, control of the light and dark squares, potential night outposts, the invisible architecture of the game lit up in her mind's eye. By move 12, the tension in the room was palpable. Richard had sacrificed a pawn for immense developmental advantage. He sat back in his chair, swirling his scotch, a look of profound boredom on his face. "You're playing like a man who's afraid to lose his pension, Arthur," Richard taunted, his voice carrying over the silence of the room. A few of the younger sycophants chuckled nervously. Arthur's face flushed. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. He reached out and moved his bishop to a 6, attacking Richard's knight. Clara winced inwardly. A blunder, she thought, her heart sinking for the kind old man. He's trying to relieve the pressure, but he just abandoned the defense of his king's flank. Richard is going to tear him apart. She watched as Richard's eyes snapped to the board. The boredom vanished, replaced by the sharp, cruel focus of a shark smelling blood. He didn't even hesitate. He picked up his queen and slammed it down on h5. "Check," Richard said softly. Arthur gasped softly, his eyes darting frantically across the board. The trap had sprung. From Clara's vantage point, the massacre was inevitable. It wasn't a quick mate. Richard was intentionally prolonging it. He was playing with his food. Over the next 10 moves, Richard methodically stripped away Arthur's defenses, capturing pieces not out of necessity, but to inflict maximum psychological damage. Every time Arthur moved, Richard sighed loudly, checking his Rolex. "Are we really going to play this out, Arthur? It's getting embarrassing. You're down a rook and a minor piece. Have some dignity." "I have the right to play my position," Arthur muttered, his voice cracking. Clara felt a hot flush of anger rise in her chest. She gripped the edge of her serving tray so tightly her knuckles turned white. It wasn't just the cruelty that angered her. It was the arrogance. Richard was a strong player, perhaps a master level, but his play lacked elegance. It was brute force, relying on cheap tactical tricks and psychological bullying rather than deep, beautiful strategy. By move 32, Arthur was completely paralyzed. His king was trapped in a mating net. He had no legal moves that wouldn't result in immediate capture. He stared at the board, his shoulders slumped, looking 20 years older than when the game began. Slowly, Arthur reached out and tipped his king over. The ivory piece clattered loudly against the wood. "I resign," Arthur whispered. Richard didn't offer a handshake. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and let out a short, dismissive laugh. "I told you, Arthur. Outdated. You should stick to playing checkers in the park with the pigeons. Chess is a game for men who understand how to conquer." Arthur stood up, his face pale, buttoning his jacket with shaking hands. Without a word to the room, he turned and walked toward the coat check, utterly humiliated. Richard leaned back, draining his scotch. He looked around the circle of spectators, a victorious smirk plastered across his face. "Well, next victim? Or have I sufficiently terrified the entire membership of the Oak and Iron Club?" No one moved. The men shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Richard's cruelty was well known, and no one wanted to be the next to face his public evisceration. Clara was commanded forward by a sharp snap of the floor manager's fingers. She was tasked with clearing Arthur's empty teacup and wiping down his side of the table. She stepped into the circle, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. She placed her tray on a side stand and approached the board. The pieces were still scattered in their final, brutal arrangement. As Clara reached over the board to grab the empty teacup, she couldn't help but look at the position. Richard was watching her. He noticed the way her eyes lingered on the board. He noticed the slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head as she took in the final position. "Something wrong with the arrangement, sweetheart?" Richard's voice was laced with condescension. Clara froze. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. Waitresses did not speak to members unless spoken to, and even then, only to take an order. "No, sir," Clara said softly, picking up the cup and placing it on her tray. She reached for her damp rag to wipe the marble. "Don't lie to me," Richard pressed, leaning forward. He was bored again, and he had found a new toy. "I saw you shake your head. You looked at the board and you judged it. What do you play? Does your boyfriend teach you how the horsey moves?" A few men in the crowd snickered. Clara felt the heat rushing to her cheeks. She focused entirely on the circular motion of her rag against the cold marble. "Do not engage. Do not engage. Do not engage." "I asked you a question," Richard said, his tone dropping, turning colder. "It's rude to ignore a member of the club." Clara stopped wiping. She stood up straight. The instinct to survive urged her to apologize, to scurry away. But the anger that had been simmering inside her, the anger at his cruelty to Arthur, the anger at her own powerlessness, the anger at his butchering of a game she loved, suddenly boiled over. "I was just noticing," Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady. that your mating net was inefficient, sir." The silence that followed Clara's statement was so profound, you could hear the ice shifting in Richard Sterling's empty glass. The floor manager, a strict man named Harrison, actually dropped his pen. Men in $1,000 suits stared at Clara as if she had suddenly spoken to them in ancient Aramaic. A waitress, a girl in a velvet vest whose name they didn't know, had just critiqued the chess strategy of a billionaire. Richard's smirk slowly evaporated. His slate-grey eyes narrowed, analyzing her not as a servant, but as a sudden, unexpected anomaly. "Inefficient," Richard repeated, testing the word on his tongue as if it tasted foul. "Yes, sir," Clara said. She knew she was crossing a line she could never uncross, but the dam had broken. She gestured slightly toward the board. "You played queen to h5 on move 12, forcing him into a defensive crouch. It was flashy, but if you had pushed your e-pawn to e5 instead, you would have completely severed his pawn structure. You prolonged the game by 20 moves purely for your own entertainment. It wasn't a master class in strategy, it was just messy." Harrison stepped forward, his face flushed with panic. "Mr. Sterling, I am so incredibly sorry. I will have her removed immediately. Clara, go to the back right now. You are—" "Shut up, Harrison!" Richard snapped, not breaking eye contact with Clara. He stood up slowly. He walked around the table, approaching her, until he was only a few feet away. He towered over her, but Clara forced herself not to step back. She met his gaze. "Messy," Richard whispered. He let out a low, dark chuckle. "You serve me drinks, you clean up my messes, and you think you know enough about this game to call my play messy?" "I know what I see, sir," Clara replied, her voice calm. Richard stared at her for a long moment. Then his face broke into a wide, theatrical grin. He turned to the crowd of onlookers. "Did you hear that, gentlemen? We have a grandmaster hiding in the service staff, a savant wielding a wet rag." The sycophants laughed loudly, sensing the shift in their boss's mood. Richard turned back to Clara. "All right, genius. Sit down." Clara blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Sit down." Richard pointed to the leather armchair Arthur had just vacated. "You want to critique my play? Prove it. Play me." Harrison looked like he was about to faint. "Mr. Sterling, please, it's against club policy for staff to fraternize with—" "I own 40% of this building, Harrison. I make the policies," Richard snarled, before turning his polite, deadly smile back to Clara. "Sit." Clara looked at the empty chair. A war raged inside her. If she sat down, she was risking her job. She needed this job. She needed the tips, the terrible hours, the humiliation. The hospital bills for her father's final days were a crushing weight. But looking at Richard Sterling, looking at his smug, entitled face, realizing he represented every system that had beaten her down, a cold, terrifying clarity washed over her. "I don't play for free, sir," Clara heard herself say. A collective gasp echoed through the VIP lounge. Richard's eyebrows shot up. He was genuinely surprised, and then profoundly delighted. "A hustler, even better. What are the stakes, sweetheart? You want $20? 50? "If I lose," Clara said, her voice carrying through the silent room, "I will surrender my job here immediately. I will walk out that door, and you will never have to see my face again. I will give up my livelihood." Richard tilted his head. "And if you win?" Clara looked at the expensive watches on the wrists of the men around her. She looked at Richard's tailored suit. She did the math in her head, the exact amount she needed to clear her father's medical debt, pay her back rent, and buy herself 6 months of freedom to finish her degree. $50,000, Clara said. The room erupted. Men began muttering. shaking their heads in disbelief. Harrison looked ready to call security. 50 grand? Richard laughed, a booming, genuine laugh. You have 50 grand to match? My job is my 50 grand. It's my entire life. To you, $50,000 is what you make in the time it takes you to drink a cup of coffee. The stakes are proportional. Richard stopped laughing. He studied her face. He saw no fear, no hesitation. He saw a cold, calculating intellect staring back at him. It thrilled him. He lived for high stakes, and utterly destroying this arrogant, beautiful waitress in front of his peers would be the highlight of his week. "You have a deal," Richard said. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a sleek black checkbook, and slapped it onto the marble table. He uncapped a fountain pen, scribbled the amount and his signature, and tore the check out, placing it under the edge of the chessboard. "There's your 50 grand, Richard said. "Take a seat." Clara handed her serving tray to a stunned Harrison. She wiped her hands on her apron, took a deep breath, and walked around the table. She sank into the plush leather chair. It was still warm from Arthur. She looked across the board at Richard. He was already resetting the pieces, his movements fast and practiced. "I'll give you the white pieces," Richard offered magnanimously. "A handicap for the working class." "No," Clara said quietly, reaching out and turning the board so the black pieces faced her. "You opened last game. I want you to play exactly the way you did before. Show me your aggression, Mr. Sterling." Richard's jaw tightened. The amusement was gone. He was no longer playing a joke. He felt insulted. He slammed his white pawn to d4. The game had begun. Richard Sterling's opening move, pawn to d4, was a statement of territorial dominance. He expected Clara to mirror Arthur's timid play, perhaps offering a passive response that would allow him to build an impenetrable center. He wanted to crush her quickly, to turn her defiance into a cautionary tale for anyone else in the Oak and Iron Club who forgot their place. Clara did not hesitate. Her hand, still slightly damp from the bar towel, moved with liquid grace. She brought her knight out to f6. Cluck! The sound was sharp, decisive. Richard raised an eyebrow. The Indian defense. A standard, respectable response, but he had dismantled it 100 times against men with degrees from Wharton and Harvard. He immediately pushed his pawn to c4, expanding his control. Clara countered instantly, pushing her pawn to gi6. She was preparing to fianchetto her bishop, aiming it down the longest diagonal on the board like a sniper rifle. "The King's Indian," Richard murmured, a smirk playing on his lips. "Ambitious for a girl who fetches ice. It requires a deep understanding of hypermodern theory. You're inviting me to take the center so you can counterattack later. Bold, but foolish against a superior force." "I prefer the Grinfeld, actually," Clara corrected him softly, her eyes never leaving the board. Before Richard could process the remark, he pushed his knight to c3. Clara immediately struck at his center, with pawn to d5. The Grinfeld defense. It was a notoriously complex, razor-sharp opening, favored by grandmasters like Garry Kasparov. It didn't just invite the opponent to build a massive pawn center. It demanded it, only to immediately subject that center to relentless, mathematical pressure. A low murmur rippled through the spectators. Among the onlookers was a man named Thomas Sterling, no relation to Richard, a retired hedge fund manager who had once been a titled chess master in his youth, frequenting the old Manhattan Chess Club on West 46th Street. Thomas leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles. He recognized the opening, and more importantly, he recognized the terrifying speed with which Clara was playing it. Richard, annoyed by the sudden tension in the room, decided to force the issue. He captured her pawn on d5. He expected her to pause, to calculate the recapture. Instead, Clara's knight swept across the board, snapping up the white pawn in less than a second. She hit the chess clock, a phantom habit from her tournament days, though there was no clock on the table. She simply tapped the marble next to the board, a psychological tick that made Richard flinch. "You play fast," Richard noted, his voice losing a fraction of its booming confidence. "I value my time, Mr. Sterling. I have a subway to catch in an hour." A few of the younger executives covered their mouths to hide their shock. Richard's jaw tightened. He deployed his pawn to a 4, kicking her knight away and establishing the massive, imposing pawn center he had craved. This was the critical moment of the Grinfeld. If Clara retreated passively, Richard would suffocate her, just as he had suffocated Arthur. But Clara didn't retreat. She initiated the exchange variation, trading her knight for his on c3. Richard recaptured with his b-pawn, bolstering his center, but slightly compromising his queenside structure. Then, Clara unleashed her bishop to g7. The board transformed. Suddenly, Richard's imposing center didn't look like a fortress. It looked like a target. Clara's bishop, operating from the shadows of the king side, was X-raying Richard's position, exerting immense, invisible pressure on his d4 pawn. For the first time all evening, Richard stopped to think. He stared at the board, the gears turning in his head. The smugness had vanished, replaced by a rigid, calculating intensity. He developed his bishop to c4, a classic, aggressive deployment in the Russian system of the Grinfeld, preparing to launch an attack on her king. Clara responded by castling her king to safety, her face an unreadable mask. She wasn't playing the man, she was playing the geometry. In her mind, the 64 squares had dissolved into a matrix of intersecting vectors. She remembered the nights her father had kept her up late in their cramped kitchen, going over variations of this exact line until the sun came up over the East River. "The center is an illusion, Clara," he used to say, coughing into his handkerchief. "Let them build their towers. Then, cut the foundation." "You're very quiet," Richard sneered, trying to reclaim the psychological upper hand. He pushed his pawn to h4. It was a caveman attack, a crude, brute force attempt to rip open the files in front of her king. "Are you realizing how out of your depth you are? I can see the panic setting in." Clara finally looked up from the board. She met his cold, slate-grey eyes. "I'm not panicking, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice echoing in the dead silent VIP lounge. "I'm just calculating how many moves it will take until you realize you've already lost." The audacity of her statement hit the room like a physical blow. Harrison, the floor manager, squeezed his eyes shut, mentally preparing the paperwork for Clara's termination. But Thomas, the retired chess master, let out a sharp, breathless laugh. He stepped closer to the table, his eyes darting frantically across the pieces. Richard's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. "You arrogant little—" He didn't finish the sentence. He aggressively slid his h-pawn forward again to h5, fully committing to the kingside assault. It was reckless. He was throwing caution to the wind, desperate to crush her and restore his bruised ego. Clara didn't even acknowledge the marching pawn. She ignored the threat to her king entirely and struck at the heart of the board. She pushed her pawn to c5. Crack. It was the thematic break of the Grinfeld defense. She was challenging the very foundation of his central control. If Richard ignored it, his center would collapse. If he captured it, his pawn structure would be permanently shattered. Sweat began to bead on Richard Sterling's forehead. The expensive, custom-tailored Brioni suit suddenly felt incredibly restrictive. The ambient temperature in the Oak and Iron Club hadn't changed, but Richard felt as though he were trapped in a furnace. He looked at Clara's c5 pawn Then, at his own overextended kingside attack. He had miscalculated, horribly. He realized with a sickening drop in his stomach that the girl sitting across from him was not a waitress who happened to know a few chess openings. She was a predator who had lured him into the deep water. Her pieces were harmonized in a way that defied amateur play. Every piece defended another. Every attack held a hidden, secondary threat. Desperate to maintain the initiative, Richard brought his queen out to D2, preparing to bring his rook into the attack. Clara's response was immediate and devastating. She developed her knight to C6, adding a third attacker to his critical D4 pawn. The pressure was becoming unbearable. The structural integrity of Richard's position was groaning under the mathematical weight of her pieces. The spectators were no longer whispering. The silence was absolute, broken only by the clinking of ice in abandoned glasses and the ragged, shallow breathing of the billionaire. Men who routinely negotiated nine-figure mergers were leaning in, captivated by the brutal, silent execution taking place on the marble table. Richard stared at the board for 3 full minutes. In the world of rapid chess, 3 minutes was an eternity. It was a public confession of confusion. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand. He had to defend the center. He pushed his bishop to E3. Clara's eyes flicked over the board. She saw the floor instantly. The bishop move defended the pawn, but it blocked the defense of another critical square. She reached out and picked up her c-pawn, capturing his pawn on D4. Richard exhaled, thinking the tension was broken. He confidently recaptured with his c-pawn. "A trade," he grunted, trying to sound authoritative. "You relieved the pressure for me. Thank you." Clara didn't reply. She didn't need to. She reached for her queen. She didn't move it to a safe, defensive square. She slid it diagonally across the board, landing it softly on a 5. Check. Richard blinked. He looked at her queen, then at his king. The check wasn't just a nuisance. It was a double attack. Her queen was simultaneously attacking his king and putting immense pressure on his newly moved bishop. He hurriedly moved his king to F1, forfeiting his right to castle and trapping his own rook in the corner. His position was now a tangled, uncoordinated mess. The majestic, aggressive posture he had struck 20 moves ago had been reduced to a desperate scramble for survival. Clara leaned forward. The timid, invisible waitress was gone. In her place sat a woman radiating quiet, terrifying authority. "You pushed your pawns too fast, Mr. Sterling," Clara said, her voice dropping to a conversational murmur that only he could hear. "You left your king behind to watch them die. Now, he's going to die with them." Without waiting for him to compose himself, Clara picked up her dark-squared bishop. It had been sitting quietly on G4, pinning his knight. Now, she moved it, capturing his knight on F3. Richard stared at the board in horror. If he recaptured with his pawn, his kingside defenses would be utterly obliterated, leaving his king naked and exposed to her queen and rook. If he didn't recapture, he was down a crucial piece, and the attack would continue anyway. He looked up at Clara. The slate-grey eyes that usually instilled fear in boardrooms were now wide with an unfamiliar emotion. Sheer, unadulterated panic. He looked at the $50,000 check resting under the edge of the board. He looked at the circle of his peers, watching him bleed out on 64 squares. He was drowning, and the waitress was holding the anvil. The Oak and Iron Club, usually a sanctuary of booming laughter and clinking crystal, had descended into a suffocating silence. The air felt thick, heavy with the metallic tang of impending ruin. Richard Sterling's hand hovered over the board, trembling violently. He was a man who traded in fear, orchestrating corporate buyouts that left thousands unemployed without batting an eye. But the fear he felt now was intensely personal, a visceral panic gripping his chest. He stared at Clara's dark, squared bishop, sitting arrogantly on f3, having just slaughtered his knight. Jonathan Pierce, a real estate mogul whose net worth rivaled Richard's, leaned over to Thomas, the retired chess master. "He has to take it," Jonathan whispered, his voice barely audible, but carrying perfectly in the dead room. "If he doesn't take the bishop, she brings the rook down the c-file and mates him in 5. His kingside is a graveyard." Richard heard the whisper. A dark, ugly flush crept up his neck, staining his custom collar. His peers, the men who usually grovelled for his favour, were analysing his execution. He looked at Clara. She sat perfectly still, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She looked entirely detached, as if she were waiting for a delayed subway train rather than dismantling a billionaire. Gritting his teeth, Richard reached out and snatched his g-pawn, capturing Clara's bishop on f3. The move shattered his pawn structure. The defensive wall in front of his king, already compromised, was now blown completely open. Clara didn't blink. She immediately slid her rook from a8 to c8. The move was quiet, but its implications were deafening. She was seizing the open c-file, pointing a heavy artillery piece directly at his pinned, paralyzed queenside. "You're cheating!" Richard hissed suddenly. The words slipped out of his mouth before he could stop them, born of sheer desperation. The room gasped. Harrison, the floor manager, took a step forward, his hands raised placatingly. "Mr. Sterling, please, let's not make accusations." "Shut up, Harrison," Richard barked, slamming his palm flat against the marble table. The pieces rattled. "Look at her! Look at her background! She's a waitress. She pours cheap gin for a living. There is absolutely no way she's calculating these lines. She's wearing an earpiece. Someone is feeding her an engine's moves." He pointed a shaking finger at Clara. "Empty your pockets. I want her searched. Right now." Clara didn't move. She didn't look angry. She looked profoundly disappointed. It was the same look her father used to give her when she skipped her chess studies to watch television. Before Harrison could intervene, Thomas stepped directly up to the table. The older man adjusted his spectacles, his eyes hard. "Sit down, Richard, and lower your voice. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are insulting the integrity of this club." "Thomas, she is a fraud. She is playing the Prince variation of the Grinfeld. You absolute fool!" Thomas snapped, his voice ringing with aristocratic authority. "And she is playing it brilliantly. You walked directly into a theoretical trap that was published in Chess Informant over 20 years ago. The only fraud at this table is the man who thought a big bank account could compensate for a lack of strategic depth. Play your move, or forfeit the wager." Richard swallowed hard. The room had turned against him. The pack mentality of the ultra-rich was ruthless. They smelled blood, and they were no longer on his side. He was the wounded animal now. He looked back at the board. His position was terminal. His king was trapped on f1. His rooks were disconnected, stuck in opposite corners of the board, utterly useless. Clara's pieces, however, were swarming like locusts. In a blind panic, attempting to force a trade to relieve the suffocating pressure, Richard moved his queen to b3, attacking her b7 pawn and aiming a weak threat at her knight. It was the final, fatal mistake. Clara's eyes locked onto the move, and a cold, fleeting shadow of a smile touched the corners of her mouth. She picked up her knight. She didn't retreat it. She didn't defend the pawn. She drove the knight deep into the heart of Richard's territory, slamming it down on d4. The sound of the piece hitting the marble echoed like a gunshot. The air inside the oak and iron club had grown unbearably dense, heavy with the scent of aged cedar and the sour tang of billionaire panic. Richard Sterling's breathing was ragged, a harsh, scraping sound that echoed in the absolute silence of the VIP lounge. He had just slid his White King to G2, a desperate, scrambling retreat, hoping to find some fragile shelter behind the mangled wreckage of his pawns. He was a man accustomed to viewing the world from the summit of glass skyscrapers, orchestrating the financial ruin of entire corporations with the casual stroke of a fountain pen. But here, confined within the 64 squares of the polished marble board, his vast wealth was entirely useless. He was bleeding out, and every man in the room knew it. Clara Hayes sat perfectly still. The ambient noise of the club, the distant hum of Manhattan traffic, the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner, seemed to fade into an absolute ringing void. The geometry of the board had resolved itself in her mind, not as a collection of carved ivory and ebony pieces, but as a brilliant, glowing web of intersecting vectors. She looked at her dark-squared queen, currently perched on a 5. For a fleeting second, the opulent surroundings dissolved. Clara wasn't in the Upper East Side anymore. She was 10 years old again, sitting at a wobbly, formica-topped kitchen table in a cramped apartment in Astoria. The radiator was hissing violently, fighting a losing battle against the bitter January chill. Across from her sat her father, his face pale and drawn from the early stages of the illness that would eventually take his life, his eyes burning with an intense, quiet passion as he arranged the pieces. "The amateur hoards his pieces, Clara," her father's voice echoed in her memory, raspy but firm. "He clings to material because he is afraid of the void. He thinks a queen is a shield. But the master knows that the pieces are just tools. They exist to control space. They exist to weave the net. When the enemy king is naked, when you see the final cage, you do not hesitate. You burn the ships. You sacrifice the most beautiful thing on the board, because the geometry demands it." Clara blinked, bringing the oak and iron club back into sharp focus. The memory anchored her. The anger that had propelled her to challenge Richard had burned away, leaving behind a cold, pristine mathematical clarity. She was no longer a waitress defending an old man's honor. She was an executioner carrying out a logical inevitability. The crowd of millionaires leaned in closer, a circle of tailored wool and silk, pressing tightly around the marble table. William, the banking executive, was gripping the back of a leather armchair so tightly his knuckles were white. Jonathan Pierce, the real estate mogul, was nervously chewing the inside of his cheek. They were waiting for Clara to deliver a punishing, methodical sequence of checks. They expected her to slowly grind Richard down, to humiliate him, move by excruciating move, just as he had done to Arthur Pendleton. Instead, Clara reached out and gently pinched the crown of her black queen. She didn't slide it to a safe square. She didn't capture one of Richard's hanging pawns to solidify a material advantage. With a slow, fluid motion that seemed to defy the intense gravity of the room, she lifted the queen and carried it diagonally across the entire length of the board. She brought it down deep inside Richard's territory, landing it squarely on the H3 square, directly adjacent to his trembling white king. The soft clack of the piece hitting the marble sounded like a judge's gavel striking a block. "Check," Clara said. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a thunderclap. The immediate reaction in the room was one of profound, suffocating confusion. The men surrounding the table stared at the Black Queen, sitting on H3, completely unsupported. There was no knight protecting it. There was no bishop backing it up. It was the most powerful piece on the board, freely offered to the enemy king. It was a hanging piece, a monumental, catastrophic blunder. Richard Sterling jolted backward in his leather chair as if he had been physically struck. His slate-grey eyes widened to the size of saucers, darting frantically from the Black Queen to his king, and then up to Clara's face. His brain, flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, violently rejected the visual information. He looked for the trap. He scoured the diagonals, traced the files, desperately searching for the hidden sniper that would punish him for taking the piece. But there was nothing. The Queen was truly, miraculously, free. A massive, shuddering breath escaped Richard's lungs. The unbearable tension that had been crushing his chest suddenly vanished, replaced by a euphoric, dizzying rush of relief. The waitress had cracked. The pressure of the room, the $50,000 stakes, the sheer audacity of what she was doing. It had finally broken her. She had played too fast, lost her nerve, and thrown away her biggest advantage in a momentary lapse of concentration. A low, guttural chuckle began to vibrate in Richard's throat. It bubbled up into a loud, manic laugh that shattered the silence of the VIP lounge. "You stupid, arrogant girl," Richard gasped, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. His triumphant sneer returned, uglier and more venomous than before. He looked around at his peers, desperate to re-establish his dominance. "Did you all see that? The pressure cooked her brain. She thought she was Bobby Fischer, and she just blundered her queen on a one-move miscalculation. Unbelievable." He turned his blazing eyes back to Clara. He wanted to see her cry. He wanted to see the realization of her mistake wash over her, to watch the hope drain from her face as she realized she was going to lose her job, her dignity, and the match. "I told you, sweetheart, you're out of your depth. Chess is a game for men who understand consequence. You just threw away your only weapon." He didn't wait for her to respond. He was too eager to close the jaws of the trap. With a trembling, eager hand, he reached out, grabbed his white king, and violently struck Clara's Black Queen, knocking it off the board. He slammed his king down onto the H3 square, clutching her captured queen in his fist like a grotesque trophy. "I'll take that," Richard spat, his voice dripping with venom and relief. "Now, let's see how you handle a real—" His voice trailed off. Thomas, the retired chess master, who had been standing at the edge of the table, suddenly let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. The older man staggered backward, bumping into Jonathan Pierce. All the color had drained from Thomas's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He wasn't looking at the captured queen in Richard's hand. He was staring at the board with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. "My God," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling violently. "My dear God in heaven." Richard's gloating smile faltered. He looked at Thomas, annoyed by the dramatic interruption. "What is your problem, Thomas?" "The game is over. She lost her queen." "The game is over, Richard," Thomas replied, his voice barely audible. He slowly raised a shaking finger and pointed at the marble board. But not for her. Clara hadn't blinked. She hadn't reacted to Richard's insults, his manic laughter, or his violent capture of her queen. She sat with the absolute stillness of a predator that had finally lured its prey into the deepest part of the cave. She didn't mourn the loss of her queen, because the queen had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had acted as bait, pulling the White King out of its defensive bunker and dragging it to the exact square she needed it to occupy. The king was now sitting on H3. The final piece of the equation was in place. Slowly, deliberately, Clara reached across the board. Her hand hovered over her dark squared rook, which had been waiting patiently on the C8 square. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The millionaire spectators, following Thomas's horrified gaze, suddenly began to see the invisible lines of force radiating across the board. The relief that had flooded the room a moment ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Clara picked up the rook. The piece felt heavy in her fingers, charged with a strange, terminal electricity. She did not slam it down. She did not mirror Richard's violent, theatrical aggression. She slid the rook straight down the C-file with a smooth, deadly grace, stopping it exactly on the C3 square. The piece settled onto the marble with a soft, final click. Clara slowly pulled her hand back, resting it on her lap. She lifted her chin, looking directly into Richard Sterling's wide, bloodshot eyes. She did not raise her voice. She simply stated a mathematical, inescapable fact. Checkmate. The word dropped into the dead silence of the Oak and Iron Club like a heavy stone into a bottomless well. Richard Sterling froze. His fist, still tightly clutching Clara's captured Black Queen, hovered awkwardly in the air. A sickening, icy feeling began to spread outward from his stomach, paralyzing his limbs. He slowly, agonizingly, dragged his eyes down to the board. His brain frantically tried to process the geometry of his own destruction. His white king was sitting on H3. Directly to its left, Clara's newly placed rook on C3 had created an impenetrable horizontal wall across the entire third rank. The king could not move left or right. Above the king, Clara's dark-squared bishop, which had been sitting quietly on G7 for the last 20 moves, was firing down the long diagonal like a laser beam, completely severing any escape to the fourth rank. And below the king, Richard's own white pawns, the pawns he had so aggressively pushed to crush her in the opening, were now acting as the bars of his own prison, physically blocking him from retreating to the second rank. There were no legal moves. There were no pieces left to interpose and block the attack. The king was perfectly, flawlessly trapped in a cage of its own making, executed in the open center of the board without a single piece to defend it. It was a forced mate, an inescapable, mathematically perfect death. For 10 agonizing seconds, no one in the room dared to breathe. The silence was absolute. It wasn't the silence of anticipation, it was the silence of a viewing at a funeral. The men who had built their lives on power, leverage, and the ruthless exploitation of weakness were collectively bearing witness to the brutal, undeniable execution of one of their own. Richard Sterling's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The physical reality of the board simply refused to align with his immense ego. He tried to raise his hand, instinctively reaching for his rook, desperate to find a hidden defensive resource that didn't exist. But his arm felt like lead. His hand hovered over the pieces, shaking uncontrollably, his fingers twitching in a phantom effort to rewrite reality. He looked up at Clara. The girl in the velvet vest, the invisible waitress who fetched ice and wiped up spilled scotch. Her face was an unreadable mask of calm. There was no gloating in her eyes, no triumphant sneer. There was only a profound, devastating pity. An immortal, Thomas whispered, breaking the suffocating silence. Tears were welling in the old master's eyes as he stared at the final arrangement of the pieces. A queen sacrifice to force the king into a geometric mating net. It's flawless. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. The spell broke. The sycophants who had laughed at Richard's jokes only an hour ago suddenly took a collective step backward, physically distancing themselves from the table. The pack mentality of the ultra-rich was swift and unforgiving. They smelled weakness. Richard was no longer the apex predator of the Oak and Iron Club. He was a bleeding carcass, thoroughly and publicly humiliated by a member of the service staff. The myth of his invincibility had been permanently shattered. Harrison, the floor manager, was leaning against a stone pillar, clutching his chest as if he were having palpitations. He stared at Clara with a mixture of absolute terror and profound awe. Clara did not wait for Richard to speak. She didn't need to hear his surrender, because the board had already spoken for him. She stood up smoothly. With quiet, deliberate movements, she reached up and unbuttoned the black velvet vest of her uniform, slipping it off her shoulders. She folded it neatly and draped it over the back of the plush leather chair she had just occupied. She reached her hand under the edge of the marble chessboard and pulled out the $50,000 check bearing Richard Sterling's signature. She didn't wave it in his face. She simply folded it precisely in half and slipped it into the pocket of her plain white button-down shirt. "Keep the apron, Harrison," Clara said, her voice clear and calm, carrying perfectly across the silent room. She turned away from the table. As she walked toward the heavy, brass-handled oak doors of the lounge, the crowd of millionaires and billionaires parted for her instantly. Men who owned skyscrapers and commanded fleets of private jets stepped out of her way, casting their eyes downward as she passed. She moved through the sea of bespoke suits like a ghost, her posture straight, her head held high. Behind her, at the center of the room, Richard Sterling remained frozen in his chair. The captured Black Queen finally slipped from his numb fingers, clattering loudly against the marble floor and rolling away into the shadows. He stared blankly at the cage on the board, a broken king in a ruined empire, listening to the steady, fading sound of Clara's footsteps as she walked out of the club, out of his world, and into a life of her own. Power, ultimately, is not defined by bank accounts or tailored suits. It is a measure of clarity in the face of chaos. Clara Hayes walked out of the Oak and Iron Club that night and never returned. The $50,000 check cleared the next morning, erasing her father's medical debts and paying for her return to Columbia University's mathematics department. Richard Sterling, however, never fully recovered. The story of his brutal, public humiliation at the hands of a waitress leaked through the insular walls of Manhattan's elite, permanently fracturing his aura of invincibility. He stopped playing chess entirely. Clara proved that genius does not wear a uniform, and that the most dangerous opponent is never the one shouting from the head of the table, but the quiet observer in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike.